Welcome to the Just Practice Collaborative series on Steps to End Policing in Prisons, a mixtape on transformative justice. Today our session is Prison Industrial Complex 101, A Vision to End Prisons, Policing, and Surveillance by Mariame Kaba. Prisons are relatively new experiments. They are not broken, nor are they rehabilitative. They exist to punish, contain, and control. The Prison Industrial Complex, or PIC, reinforces and reproduces systems of oppression that perpetuate the violence we experience. The PIC is naturalized, and many people struggle to imagine a world without it. In this workshop, we'll discuss what PIC abolition means and how an abolitionist vision and framework is essential to organizing. Now to introduce our presenter. Mariame Kaba is an organizer, educator, and curator who is active in movements for racial, gender, and transformative justice. She is the founder and director of Project NIA, a grassroots organization with a vision to end youth incarceration. Mariame is currently a researcher at Interrupting Criminalization, Research and Action at the Barnard Center for Research on Women, a project she co-founded with Andrea Ritchie in 2018. Mariame has co-founded multiple other organizations and projects over the years, including We Charge Genocide, the Chicago Freedom School, the Chicago Task Force on Violence Against Girls and Young Women, Love and Protect, the Just Practice Collaborative, and Survived and Punished. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mariame.
Thank you so much for having me today. I am thrilled to be offering this PIC 101 workshop. Thank you for the introductions. I won't go back into all of that. I use she, her pronouns. And as I mentioned, this is an introductory workshop that is going to expose you to prison industrial complex abolition. So let's focus on the workshop goals. The workshop goals are threefold. We are going to explore a working definition of PIC abolition. We're going to discuss the basic principles and politics of an abolitionist vision. And we are also going to discuss how we apply PIC abolition in our current organizing work. I want to kind of hold a few values and commitments during the time that we spend together this afternoon or this morning, depending on when you're watching this. I want to talk about the values that are important and the commitments that are important. I hope that folks will be willing to try on new ideas. Prison industrial complex abolition can be challenging for people, particularly if you've never even considered the idea that we don't have to have prisons and that we didn't always have prisons. So I hope that you'll be willing to try on new ideas. At Just Practice, we often talk about the fact that curiosity and judgment can't coexist. And what really this is saying is when you find yourself feeling judgmental about something, it's good to ask questions about what that's really about, to get curious about the judgment, to ask further questions and get more clarification about why you're feeling the way that you're feeling, why you're, reacting the way that you're reacting. So we think that curiosity and judgment can't coexist and that we should always stay curious. I hope that this is going to be a generative space for you. And I also know that generative space is sometimes uncomfortable space. So stick with that discomfort. Don't shy away from it. Lean into it. And again, get curious about it. And finally, take care of yourself. One of the wonderful aspects of being able to share and learn together via digital platforms and via webinars like this is that you can stop and start and move and do different kinds of things according to what your needs are. And this is something that I very much encourage. Some of the, thinking about harm and prisons and policing and surveillance can bring up lots of feelings for us because they're so tied to our values, and they're so tied to the way we live, and they're so tied to our experiences and what's happened to us. So if you feel yourself kind of getting activated by some of what is shared and talked about, stop the tape, stop the video, stop the audio, and do what you need to do to take care of yourselves. The next slide is just a focus on some things that you should keep in mind. This workshop webinar will not be the answers to all the questions that you have. It's just not possible to do that in 90 minutes or less. Also, a big part of prison industrial complex abolition is that we are really open and understand that it's important for us to kind of know that we're always going to have more questions, that nothing is ever going to be resolved. There's no finality to anything in terms of our social life. So we're always going to be questioning. That's a good thing. And so if you leave this session with more questions you've jotted down, perfect. That's what I'm hoping for. This workshop will also offer you guidance for more reading, for more study, for more practice. And I hope that you'll bring what you learned back to your communities, and that you will try to keep building with your communities, because you have particular hyper-local conditions that are going to constrain but also expand the possibilities of what you can do in your organizing. And, you know, I'm not from everybody's community who is actually watching this and listening to this today. So take the knowledge back, go to your people, keep struggling over these ideas over time. I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to do together today, how we're going to move through the sessions. Right now, I'm in the midst of doing some introductory stuff, talking about goals for the workshop, and then also discussing the values and commitments and what this is and is not. Then we're going to go into an opening reflection. So one thing I'd love you to do during the time, if you don't already have in front of you pen and paper, please get some pens, please get some paper. And I'm going to ask you all the way through to do some reflection as we go through, to do some activities along with me. So get all that stuff together. And if you haven't gotten it yet, pause and then go get it and then come back. We're also going to be talking about what is the prison industrial complex. Remember that we're talking about prison industrial complex abolition. So we need to unpack what the PIC, and I'll use the term PIC from now on, what that really is. What's the scope of the PIC? You know, what make up the parts of it, and what is the extent of it? We're going to talk a little bit about histories of the PIC. Now, we don't have a lot of time, and you can do a whole course that would be several weeks long, a semester, 2 years, whatever, that would invite you to read all about the foundations of the prison industrial complex. It's a complex, it is a composite, there are many factors, but we're going to kind of just start thinking through and peeling some of the layers around the histories of the PIC. We'll talk about definitions and principles of PIC abolition, and then we'll bring it home to organizing. A big thing that we ought to always keep in mind is that prison industrial complex abolition is a vision, but it also offers us a strategy for thinking about how we organize to win the world that we want to win. So we're going to talk about that. That will be the basic close of this session. And then we're also I'm going to share some resources with you so you can do some further study, some further reading, and understand more about that. So with that, I want to get us started with an opening reflection. As we dive into the time we have, I hope that you will just take a few minutes to jot down your answers to the following questions. What is the purpose of prisons, policing, and surveillance? What is the purpose of prisons, policing, and surveillance? And the second question is, how has your consumption of popular culture shaped your beliefs about crime, punishment, prisons, and policing? How has your consumption of popular culture shaped your beliefs about crime, punishment, prisons, and policing? So I'd love you to just take a couple of minutes to jot down your answers to this with a pen that you've got and the paper that you have. You can pause here and come back in whatever the time is that you've taken to answer these questions. And please do this because I think it's important to start off with your own benchmark of kind of where you're starting from. And hopefully at the end of this session, you'll go back and you'll read the responses you gave and ask yourself if you still think the things that you thought at the beginning of the workshop. So let's start here in trying to have a better understanding of the prison industrial complex. This concentric circles of the PIC diagram that you have in front of you that you're looking at can be accessed through Critical Resistance. Critical Resistance is an organization that in 1998 convened people from around the country, from all different sectors, to come and talk about the idea of the prison industrial complex and prison industrial complex abolition. In the modern era, Critical Resistance is the formation that then became an organization in the early 2000s that really has propelled our thinking and our organizing strategies around prison industrial complex abolition. It helped us to kind of have a space and for some people to have political homes there. But of course, PIC abolition, organizing strategy thinking happens well beyond the work of Critical Resistance. It happens in prisons and detention centers and youth prisons all around the country, but it also happens all around the world. So I lift up Critical Resistance because it's played such an incredibly important role and because you can go to their website and find a lot of resources. So what you see at the center of the diagram is that the PIC is in the center of these concentric circles. So take a piece of paper out, lay it out in in landscape style, and put the PIC at the center in a circle. And let's kind of work through the following questions. These are the questions to consider. Who benefits from the prison industrial complex? What systems of power create and are supported by imprisonment, policing, and surveillance? How does the PIC keep itself going? What are the problems that people who use the PIC say that it actually addresses? What are the real harms we face on a day-to-day basis? Who gets ensnared and caught up in the PIC? What happens when we rely on imprisonment, policing, and surveillance as solutions to social, political, and economic problems? So you have the slide that you're seeing all the questions to consider. In the middle of the diagram, you'll see if you download a copy of this online, which you can find at Concentric Circles of the PIC, you'll see in the middle that it says the PIC is a set of interests. And the PIC is a set of interests is just another way of asking who actually benefits from the PIC. So if you're taking notes, you're maybe going to write down prison guards maybe benefit from the PIC. Perhaps people who work in courts benefit from the PIC. Perhaps police officers benefit from the PIC. How about social workers that work in the systems? How about people who teach in prisons in various ways? How about ourselves? What ways do we as individuals benefit from the PIC? For example, sometimes we purchase goods that were made by incarcerated people. Sometimes we consume media that was created about, people ensnared within the PIC. There are so many ways that you can imagine and you can like think through, and you should list out all the different players, the corporations, the politicians, all the different players, the institutions that benefit from the prison industrial complex. List all of those out. The next concentric circle says empowered by these forces. So again, goes back to the question we asked before, which was what systems of power create and are supported by imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, right? And often, you can think about what those forces are. Those forces are racism. Those forces are capitalism. Those forces are transphobia. How about sexism? How about homophobia, right? Those systems of power create and also are supported by imprisonment, policing, and surveillance. The next outer ring basically says that uses these tools. So question is, how does the PIC actually keep itself going, right? And you could kind of think about all of the ways that the PIC keeps itself going, how it keeps itself relevant, right? It uses social control. It uses punishment. It uses militarization, right? It uses all these different kinds of tools of oppressions to actually keep the PIC going, right? It creates media images that make us believe that the cops are only doing good work on a regular basis, right? So how does it keep itself going? The next outer ring in the concentric circles are as a response to these problems. So this goes to the question of what are the problems that people who use the PIC say it currently addresses, right? Sometimes people say the PIC actually addresses violence, correct? That's what we hear. We hear that it may address abuse of various forms. Sometimes we hear that the PIC actually addresses mental illness or poverty, or that it has an impact on people's drug addiction and substance using, right? That in order for these things to be controlled, in order for these things to be managed, to be contained, we need the prison industrial complex. The next is this affects and targets these people. So this goes to the question of who gets ensnared and caught up in the PIC. And here you can list out all the groups of folks, people of color, people who are political dissenters, people who are poor, women, queer people, trans people, children and youth and young people, immigrants. All these folks are affected and ensnared by the prison industrial complex. Poor white people, right? We know this. They're, compared to other white people, more disproportionately impacted at getting caught up by the prison industrial complex. And then the last rung is, and the PIC produces these results. So it's like, what happens when we rely on imprisonment, policing, and surveillance as the solutions to social, political, and economic problems? We see negative impacts on people's lifespan, right? So people who are incarcerated, for example, live shorter lives. That has a direct public health, impact. We see the ways that people are disenfranchised from the system, right? You get incarcerated and you lose your right to vote in many states. We see the way that people in communities are devastated and further marginalized by the use of these death-making institutions of imprisonment, policing, and surveillance. So it's really helpful to think about how these, concentric circles help us to actually come to what a definition of the prison industrial complex would be, right? Look at what we have in front of us. After you've answered these questions and gone through all these circles and given your own ideas, you have to think of like what's actually in front of us and what is it going to take, to vision a world without all these structures, without all these forces, without all this harm. And you also see, because this is concentric circles, that these circles build on each other. And so that tells us something about how we have to organize. Because how are we going to, quote unquote, actually decriminalize drugs, for example, without actually addressing racism? How are we going to find ways to actually provide people's needs in the world so that they're not starving and they're not struggling without a living wage? How are we going to eliminate poverty without ending capitalism? These things build on each other, and you can see the compounding aspect of this is what creates the force of the prison industrial complex and system. So what I want to do now is have us listen to Maya Shenwar, who's a writer and an abolitionist, a PIC abolitionist, as Maya defines what the prison industrial complex is from her perspective. And then we're going to come back and we're going to try to come up with a definition.
I think it's kind of like a shifting combination of things in my mind. It's not only all of the things that prop up and fuel the prison system, including, all of the industrial interests, all of the business interests, all of the government interests, all of the politicians who are propping up their careers based on this. But also all of the structures that both make this possible and gave birth to it in the first place. And so I think one of the things that prison industrial complex as a term does is it challenges that idea that the prison system is broken, because it's saying this was actually constructed to do what it's doing right now. It's constructed as a tool of oppression. It's constructed as a tool of marginalization, and a tool in particular to oppress particular groups, and particularly Black people, poor people, Native people, all of disabled people. And also those groups shift, depending on the era, depending on the purpose. Obviously, simultaneously, many groups are targeted, and prison serves the purpose of oppression depending on the ways in which communities need those oppressions. And so I think prison industrial complex, the word that's most important to me in there is complex. And it's kind of a double meaning because it's a complex, it's, things constructed on top of each other and things that can be built out. One of the features of the prison industrial complex is the ways in which it expands, and the ways in which the net widens is the expression that a lot of people have been using lately, I think, because the prison industrial complex doesn't obviously only include prisons and jails. It includes all of the other carceral mechanisms and mechanisms of policing and surveillance in which alternatives are built up.
I think that after listening to Maya's description and explanation of the prison industrial complex, I think what I want to do is to uplift this definition that critical resistance created about the prison industrial complex. They say and write, the prison industrial complex is a term we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. And as Maya suggests, in her kind of explanation of the prison industrial complex, that complex is the part that's so important here, right? That it's compounding, it's overlapping, they build on each other. The system is always ever expanding, always looking for more ways to encompass more of our lives. The system is dynamic, and that means that it's constantly shifting. And that means that we, as organizers and people who want to shrink and then eliminate the prison industrial complex altogether, that we have to be dynamic. We have to adapt. We have to constantly be shifting, right? And again, so important to keep in mind and to ask yourself a question about whether there's anything in our society, the entire society, that can't be actually related to punishment, imprisonment, policing, or surveillance. And the answer is you probably can't find anything that's not in some way connected to the PIC. And so that's the thing that I hope you kind of leave with early on here, is that it's really a set of overlapping interests. It's really not just prisons, but it's the surveillance systems, it's policing, it's all the different kinds of forms of imprisonment, even those forms we don't think about now, like incarceration. Those things are all part of the prison industrial complex. And so let's make sure that we're thinking about that as we are moving through in our conversation about PIC abolition. If we don't know what the PIC is, how the hell are we going to be able to actually abolish it? If we don't understand the intricacies and the ways that the overlapping systems feed off of each other and expand on a regular basis, how are we going to find a strategy to shrink that system? So let's move to the next conversation here that tells us a little bit about how we've actually gone ahead and defined the PIC in terms of its scope. So in the United States, there are nearly 2,000 state and federal prisons. There are over 2,970 local jails, so almost 3,000 local jails. There are also 218 migrant detention centers, which are just migrant jails. There are over 1.5 million people who are incarcerated on any given day in the United States in state and federal prisons. And as a whole, there are about 2.2 million people who are incarcerated if you include the jail population, the daily jail population. There are about 690,000 people incarcerated in jails around the country, and that almost 3,000 local jails around the country on any given day. Yeah. So that is just a little bit about some facts and figures about the PIC. Let's look at the next slide that's going to give us a sense of how this breaks out in terms of the scope of the prison industrial complex. If you go to the Prison Policy Initiative, you can find every single year they create this wonderful chart that's called the whole pie, which is PIE. And they kind of break out for us who's incarcerated where in the systems, what types of crimes people are being actually incarcerated for. So we can see that in the chart, you can see 1.3 million about people in the state prison systems. You can see about 612,000 on any given day in the local jails. These vary because we also include the immigrant detention centers as jails. So that number, that's how you could get to a larger number of about 690. But anyway, the local jails, you can see that in local jails, overwhelmingly 462,000 people are not convicted of anything. They're awaiting adjudication. About 149,000 convicted. When you're convicted and you remain in jail, that's usually because you have a short sentence and they're not bothering to move you to prisons. This, unfortunately, particularly disproportionately impacts women who are incarcerated, who tend to be more disproportionately convicted and staying in jail. Jails are notoriously horrific in terms of the conditions of jail. A lot of people that I've been friends and family members and others who've been incarcerated over the years have often told me that jails, they begged to go to prison from jail because jail conditions were so terrible. And that makes sense because jail, unfortunately, makes sense within the context of this system. But jails are, transient people coming in and out all the time. So they're not paying attention to people's conditions in the same way that folks who are incarcerated for long periods of time in prisons, they attend to the conditions in a different way. The conditions are terrible and hellholish across the board. But it's interesting to think about the variations that people express. On any given day, we have about 50,000 young people under the age of 18 locked up in our system. So you'll see all of that if you go to the website of Prison Policy Initiative and you look for the whole pie. You can get more information about kind of where people are located and situated in terms of folks who are incarcerated. More information about the prison industrial complex. Police arrest 14 million people annually in the United States. Between 65 to 70 million people have a criminal record in this country. And just for some scope of that, there are about 325, 330 million people who live here in the United States. Of that number, several of those people are actually children and youth. So think about that 65 to 70 million people have a criminal record. That is so massive in terms of the numbers. And that's something that a lot of people don't pay attention to. And oftentimes criminal records have all sorts of consequences associated with it. People sometimes can't get licenses to do particular professions, like being a barber in some states. There are people who can't get housing, affordable housing, because they have a criminal record, or they can't be living with their grandmother in public housing while they have a criminal record. I mean, it has an impact. You can't get into some schools don't let you in, jobs, all the things that are the consequences of criminal records. And look at yet the numbers of folks that have one. At least 20 million people in the United States have been incarcerated at some point in their lives. On a single day, state and federal prisons and local jails hold about 2.2, 2.3 million people. Another 3.7 million people are on probation, and 840,000 are on parole. So nearly 7 million people are under some form of correctional supervision in this country, either locked up, on probation, on parole. If we add electronic monitoring to that, I mean, who knows, right? But again, under some form of correctional supervision. 4.3 million people in the United States are employed as police and guards. In 1950, a staff of 23,000 people guarded all US jails and prisons. Today, more than 700,000 people are needed to do the job. And this is all from a very useful and good book called Beyond These Walls by Tony Platt, which I recommend for people who are interested in learning more about the prison industrial complex and its impacts. I want to say that we have to really sit with that number of 4.3 million people in the US are employed as police and guards in this country. When we talk about abolishing these systems, we're talking about abolishing a lot of people's jobs. Many of these jobs are jobs that actually pay people above a living wage. We're talking about a struggle here. We're talking about a fight. And I think we cannot understand that fight if we don't understand how invested so many people are in preserving the current system and the status quo, in preserving policing and preserving imprisonment as, again, viable tools within the society that we live in. So let's take a moment and listen to some folks talking about kind of mass incarceration visualized to give you more of a sense of the numbers that you just heard me talk about.
Mass incarceration means that we've got a very high rate of incarceration historically, comparatively. And the other thing is the rate of incarceration is so high, so socially concentrated, that we're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole social groups. The rate of incarceration now is about 5 times higher than it was historically. Historically it was 100 per 100,000, now it's about 500 per 100,000. If we look at prison, if we add jail to that, it's about 700 per 100,000. Nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do. We've seen extremely high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system for African American men with very low levels of schooling. So if we think about black men who were born in the late 1970s and who are growing up through the American prison boom of the 1980s and the 1990s, the chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high school is about 70%. So going to prison for that group of black men with very low levels of schooling, that's become a normal life event. And that's really only happened in the last 10 years. We're at this point now where there's about 1.2 million African American children with a parent who's incarcerated. That's about 1 in 9. The research shows the kids who experience parental incarceration have diminished school achievement, they have behavioural problems, depressive symptoms, acting out. And there's also evidence that these kinds of negative effects associated with parental incarceration are concentrated more among boys than among girls. And there's a very real risk here that incarceration becomes an inherited trait. The underlying issue is we've chosen prison as a way to respond to that problem of crime. And there are a whole variety of ways that we could have chosen to respond to that problem of crime. We've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty. And we've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty for a historically aggrieved group whose liberty in the United States was never firmly established to begin with.
So you heard about kind of the scope and the visualization of just how incarceration has expanded and really just exploded over the last 45 years or so in the United States. There was a lot of mention of Black men and the experiences that Black men have had. And I think I want to take a moment to have us pause for a second on that kind of conversation about who is most impacted by the criminal punishment system. Let's talk a little bit here about women and trans and gender nonconforming people in the prison industrial complex. Because one of the things that I have kind of been involved in over the past few years of my life in terms of my work is the ways that there's been a growing criminalization and incarceration of women, LGBTQ people of color, and trans and gender nonconforming people over the last, few decades. The actual exponential growth that has occurred amongst those particular populations. So a 700% increase in the last, 30 years in the numbers of women, for example, who are incarcerated and criminalized. Many of those women are actually survivors of color, and who are survivors of violence of various kinds, particularly survivors of interpersonal forms of violence. So just to let you know a little bit about the numbers on that, women are the fastest growing prison and jail populations. Over the past 4 decades, the population of people incarcerated in women's prisons has increased by over 700%. The population of people incarcerated in women's jails has increased by 1,400%. The population in women's prisons has grown at more than double the rate of men prison populations over the last 4 decades. We also know that racial disparities in women's incarcerations, though they've decreased, they remain significant. So Black women are incarcerated at twice the rate of white women. We also know that nearly 1 in 2 Black trans women report incarceration in their lifetime. 2/3 of women in local jails are women of color. 44% are Black, 15% are Latinx, 5% are other women of color. Again, a less commonly known fact is that according to the Williams Institute, people incarcerated in women's facilities are disproportionately LGBTQ. So 33% of people incarcerated in women's prisons identified as lesbian or bisexual before incarceration. This number increases to 42% if people who don't necessarily identify as LGBTQ, who've had same gender sexual experiences, are included. We also know, importantly, and I want to raise this up in terms of the facts and figures and the things we care about, people with disabilities experience high rates of incarceration. And incarceration produces high rates of disability. Almost half of the people in women's jails and 40% of people in women's prisons have a disability diagnosed. There are 1.3 million women under some form of control by the criminal legal system in the US. 80% of women who are under the control of the criminal legal system are on probation and parole. So you can see a disproportionate focus on supervision as a form of control and maintenance, particularly of people who identify as women and of people who identify as LGBTQ. And I think that while we look and focus quite a bit on men and Black men in particular within the system with good reason, they're very much targeted and have been for a long time. We cannot forget the way that the PIC impacts women, gender nonconforming people, women, including obviously trans and non-trans, gender nonconforming people, LGBTQ folks. We cannot take that away. We also know that policing practices have also changed over time. Police are stopping women more often now than they were in the past. While the number of stops involving men has been going down, the number of stops of women has increased dramatically, and particularly traffic stops, other kinds of stops. And particularly women and trans people are targeted by the police often with sexual violence that's overt as part of these stops. So just, again, important to keep in mind. And for people who are interested in more about this work, you can go to interruptingcriminalization.com, which is a project that I co-founded with Andrea Ritchie and Woods Irvin, who works with us now. And we really try to, really think about that. We try to think about what is actually driving the criminalization of women and LGBTQ people. We need to focus on where and how and why women, for example, are arrested. We need to decrease the use of conditions of probation and parole, because you can see that over 80% of them are within correctional control under probation and parole. We have to move decriminalization efforts beyond drugs, for example, because women are criminalized for other things like sex work and other things that really have a particular gendered lens. So just wanted to share that with everybody a little bit as well. And want you to take a moment now, maybe a break. This is a good moment for that. And debrief. Based on what you just learned, what of this was new information for you? And what does this information then mean about how we need to organize to dismantle the prison industrial complex? This is a good moment if you would like to take a break, go get some water, go take care of your needs. When we come back, we're going to be focused on looking at the histories of the PIC. And we're also going to then move on to talking about definition of terms of PIC abolition. All right, if you left, welcome back. I want to get to the next slide and just talk about the histories of the PIC. What I want you to be thinking about in terms of the questions about the timeline of how we got to where we are, right? So we were somewhere, and how we got here was over time, many factors, many turning points. So ask yourself, how did things get like this? How did the United States become the world's largest jailer, having 5% of the world's population, a little less, and having nearly 25% of the incarcerated population of the world? How did that happen? What are some of the origins of the present situation? Who were the key players, times, places, events that have influenced the situation? What has gone on here before? What have been some of the major stages and periods through which this situation has moved? What have been some of the turning points? There are some wonderful PIC timeline tools online that I really highly suggest people Google and find. Project South did a terrific PIC timeline. There's a timeline on the PIC on the Chicago PIC Teaching Collective that I was part of co-founding years ago as part of Project NIA. There are many ways that you can go more deeply into the PIC timeline. For this purposes of this webinar and this workshop, let's go to the next slide. We're going to watch a short video that's going to kind of ground us.
In 1619, when the first Africans were brought to the British colonies by ship to Jamestown, Virginia, they held the legal status of servant. But as the region's economic system became increasingly dependent on forced labor, we descended into slavery. The institution of American slavery developed as a permanent, hereditary system centrally tied to race. Millions of black people were forcibly taken from Africa, crammed on ships and brought to the Americas through a dangerous and deadly journey that crossed the Atlantic. Millions died. Once on our shores, slavery deprived the enslaved person of any legal rights or autonomy, and granted the slave owner complete power over the black men, women, and children legally recognized as property. An ideology of white supremacy, a narrative of racial difference was created to rationalize and justify the continuation of slavery. American slavery was often brutal, barbaric, and violent. In addition to the hardship of forced labor, enslaved people were maimed or killed by slave owners as punishment for working too slowly, visiting a spouse living on another plantation, or even learning to read. Enslaved people were also sexually exploited. The United States Congress finally banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808. Slavery was widely considered a gross human rights violation, yet enslavement was retained and persisted. The 1808 Declaration caused the demand for slave labor to skyrocket in the Lower South, and the domestic slave trade grew to meet this demand. Between 1808 and 1860, the enslaved population of Alabama grew from less than 40,000 to more than 435,000. Slave traders chained African Americans together in couples and forced them to march hundreds of miles from the Upper South to the Lower South. Steamboats carried slaves along the Alabama River. Rail routes constructed with slave labor brought hundreds of enslaved people to Montgomery, Alabama every day, turning the city into one of the largest slave trading communities in the United States. Enslaved people would be paraded up Commerce Street to slave warehouses and slave depots. The city's slave market was at the Artesian Basin, now known as Court Square. Enslaved people of all ages were auctioned along with livestock, standing in line to be inspected. Public posters advertising the sale of slaves included gender, age, skill, complexion, owner's name, and price. Slavery in America traumatized and devastated millions of people. Husbands and wives, parents and children could not protect themselves from being sold away from each other. Enslaved families were separated at an owner's or auctioneer's whim, never to see each other again. The domestic slave trade separated nearly half of all enslaved people from their spouses and parents. In 1833, the Alabama legislature banned free black people from residing in the state, meaning that enslavement was the only legally authorized status for African Americans. Even as the Civil War raged, slave trading in Montgomery flourished well into the mid-1860s. After the Confederacy's surrender in 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery nationwide except as a punishment for crime. But in many former slave states, slavery did not end. It simply evolved. Southern whites, angry after losing the war, targeted black people who were largely abandoned by the federal government in the 1870s. For decades, black men, women, and children were tortured, terrorized, and killed by mobs and violent lynchings, oppressed by a system of racist laws and customs. For another 100 years, black people were racially segregated, denied the right to vote, education, and basic dignity. They were humiliated, beaten, or killed for minor offenses or for protesting. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s helped to end legally authorized racial segregation, but racial bias still persists. Today, a presumption of guilt is assigned to many people of color who are disproportionately arrested, convicted of crimes, and sent to prison. African Americans are 6 times more likely to be sentenced to prison for the same crime as a white person. 1 in 3 black males born today can expect to spend time in prison during his lifetime. Police violence against black people is so epidemic that civil rights demonstrations have shut down cities across the U.S. as thousands of people march to protest police brutality. Many states celebrate the era of slavery with Confederate holidays and by honoring the defenders and architects of slavery while ignoring the history of enslavement. The Equal Justice Initiative believes that racial bias remains a serious problem and is a direct and lasting legacy of American slavery and our failure to deal with the history of racial injustice. The Equal Justice Initiative seeks to foster an honest conversation about the legacy of slavery, about mass incarceration, and racial inequality and how it still affects millions of people today. We can confront and overcome bias and discrimination. Please join us in this conversation so that we can move forward together.
So you had a chance to take a look at the Equal Justice Initiative's short video that looked at kind of trying to tell a story between the links between enslavement, chattel slavery, and the current expansion of criminalization and what people call mass incarceration, which is really more aptly thought of as hyper criminalization, in my opinion. But yes, let's use that term of mass incarceration and mass criminalization for now. You could see the kind of linkages between what happened with chattel slavery and, the current way that we are dealing with mass criminalization. I think it's important to note that these things are not one-to-one matches, that there were many moments in between that choices were made, policies were put into place. It's not a direct line. And the origin story of mass criminalization in the US also has to take into account the genocide or the attempted genocide of Indigenous people. To this day, Indigenous people are disproportionate targets of the criminalization system, disproportionately incarcerated, disproportionately criminalized, disproportionately arrested. And we have to look at that as well. We have to also look at the kind of history of the settler colonial project and borders and the kind of manifestation and holding down of the US borders through warfare and through enforcement of policing, in law enforcement, also as a contributing factor and part of the origin story of how we got to this place of mass criminalization. So I just want to say that the truth is that there are a number of contributing factors to mass criminalization in the US. The factors are cultural, they're political, they're economic, they're social. We have to understand that white supremacy, capitalism, gendered violence are maintained and reproduced through the criminal punishment apparatus. These things are not separate from each other. These things play off of each other. These things are in dialectical relationship to each other. And so, do a lot of more reading and study beyond what is offered as like simple narrative timelines. There are waves because there's not just a direct line from enslavement to the current moment. There have been all these ruptures all along the way. There have been contestations. People have resisted, right? That's also part of the story we have to tell about mass criminalization. It's also that people have resisted all along the way and continue to resist today. So I don't want that to get lost in what you watched or understood either. So as we continue to talk about history, let's talk about prison abolition. For many people, prison abolition is a new term. And this is particularly the case today and now, as folks are being exposed in new ways to the ideas of prison and police and surveillance abolition. This is new to folks, right? But it has now exploded into the public realm as folks are in the streets with signs that say defund the police or defund policing. And often people are just like, what? What's going on here? Where's this coming from? Right? But there's a long history of people who've been making this claim for a while. And let's think about the fact that the first prisons that were established in the United States, or the very first one, the Walnut Street Jail, which is a prison that we would recognize, in terms of the modern era, was founded in 1790 in Philadelphia. And that jail, which was the place where people were being held, and they couldn't go home, like one of the first kind of the modern incarnation of what we understand to be prisons and jails, that was offered as a reform. That was supported by the Quakers initially as a reform to corporal and capital punishment. That the prison itself as an idea was a reform. And people wanted something else because they thought that the system they had was not serving the community well and was barbaric and didn't do what they hoped it would do. The prison comes into being as a reform itself. Women's prisons come into being as a reform because people are like, we can't keep men and women in the same prisons. We can't keep children and adults in the same prisons. So these keep getting, quote, perfected as reform models over time. More and more segregated in terms of gender, more and more, these are the things that we're seeing happen. But from the first, in terms of the United States, from the first prisons and jails that came into being, pretty early on, Quakers and others who had been pro these reforms were like, this ain't it. This isn't working. This is a problem. There's so much violence here. There's what we had hoped it would do in terms of rehabilitation, it doesn't actually do. We thought this would address public safety, it's not doing it, right? So the reformers who brought into being these institutions themselves pretty early on were turning against them and were advocating sometimes for a reform of that reform, but sometimes for the complete and utter destruction and dismantling of the prison itself. So I want to share, next slide, some of the kind of stories that people have, some of the kind of words that people have offered that we can put on our abolition timeline in terms of looking at the history of the concept of prison abolition in particular. And here you have, according to the minutes of the 1870 Congress of the American Prison Association, Judge Carter of Ohio avowed himself a radical on prison discipline. He favored the abolishment of prisons and the use of greater efforts for the prevention of crime. He believed they would come to the point yet. Any system of imprisonment or punishment was degradation and could not reform a man. He would abolish all prison walls and release all confined within them. The next speaker, we are told, dissented in toto from these remarks. So this is in Jessica Mitford's book, A Kind and Usual Punishment. And this is written in 1972. Jessica Mitford's book is, but she's quoting the 1870 Congress of the American Prison Association. So you can see that as in the 19th century, people are saying, abolish prisons. This is not new information. And people who were locked up from 1790 to now have written their own letters and treaties and manifestos calling for the abolishment of prisons. So it is not new that that's the case. The modern incarnation is new, but people have been thinking about this for a long time. Here's Clarence Darrow speaking to the detainees of the Cook County Jail in Chicago in 1902. He says, the only way in the world to abolish crime and criminals is to abolish the big ones and the little ones together. Make fair conditions of life. Give men a chance to live. Abolish the right of property ownership of land. Abolish monopoly. Make the world partners in production, partners in the good things of life. There should be no jails. They do not accomplish what they pretend to accomplish. If you would wipe them out, there would be no more criminals than now. They are a blot upon any civilization, and a jail is an evidence of the lack of charity of the people on the outside who make the jails and fill them with the victims of their greed. I mean, come on, y'all. Are you hearing me on this? Amazing. Here's Dr. Frank Tannenbaum, cited also again in Jessica Mitford's book. We must destroy the prison, root and branch. When I speak of the prison, I mean the mechanical structure, the instrument, the technique, the method which the prison involves. Again, 1922. Here's Eugene Debs writing in 1926. The prison as a rule, to which there are few exceptions, is for the poor. It ought not merely to be reformed, but abolished as an institution for the punishment and degradation of unfortunate human beings. Caleb Foote, who's a conscientious objector in World War II, writes, the use of the phrase, quote, prison reform disturbs me a great deal, for it seems to me that all the prison reform movements have almost always concentrated on physical and administrative conditions. I am for abolition, not reform. Again, 1946. Here's John Clutchette, who was one of the Soledad brothers, along with George Jackson and others. And John Clutchette writes a letter that was excerpted in a book which I highly recommend. It's called If They Come in the Morning. It was a book edited by Angela Davis in 1971. Today's prison system should be abolished because it is a system pre-designed and constructed to warehouse the people of underdeveloped and lower economic communities. Under the existing social order, men and women are sent to prison for labor, free labor, and further economical gain, money by the state. Where else can you get a full day's work for 2 to 16 cents an hour, and these hours become an indeterminate period of years? This is slave labor in the 20th century America. Repeat, men and women are sent to prison for free labor, not for what contributions they might make to their communities under the guise of rehabilitation. 98% of all people held in U.S. concentration camps are people of oppression. We are the people who come from the underclass of the system. We are the people castigated and barred from the productive arenas of social employment, decent housing, correct education, correct medical care, etc., etc. A war of survival. Bear with me. I don't intend to sound bitter, but only to relate the truth. We must come to know the truth. We are the people left to the crumbs of the system. We are the people who lay prey to the criminal elements of the system. The choice, survive or perish. I want to share these quotes with you and these, because I think, again, people are acting like abolition and PIC abolition is new. It isn't. It is not new as a concept. As long as there have been prisons, there have been people calling for their abolishment. And that's no different today. This is from the editors of Off Our Backs in an issue about Alderson Prison after the Attica Rebellion. And this is September 1971. How many years of people's lives must be lost, hidden, and brutalized before we see that prisons must be abolished? How many Atticas, San Quentins, and Aldersons will it take till we realize that our society has created these monstrous institutions out of fear? Fear of human freedom, cultural differences, loss of capitalist property. The ethics of our society have been distorted by this fear and are then imposed on non-white people, poor people, young people, and women to make survival and experimentation crimes. Why should people in America spend years in jail for such, quote, immoral acts as smoking grass, getting drunk, and singing in the streets, making love, or printing obscenity? Much less for standing by moral decisions not to kill or work for an immoral government. If prisons were really to protect us from psychopaths and murderers and thieves, They would contain Nixon, Rockefeller, Mitchell, Reagan, Agnew, owners of the motor industries and oil dynasties, slum landlords, church leaders, and Pentagon officials. Prisons are the extreme domestic example of the racism, sexism, militarism, and imperialism that we have been watching for years in Vietnam. This is going to be the last, but again, here is from a handbook called Instead of Prisons, which was published in 1976, which people can find online as a PDF. Perspective 1. Imprisonment is morally reprehensible and indefensible and must be abolished. In an enlightened free society, prison cannot endure or it will prevail. Abolition is a long-range goal, an ideal. The eradication of any oppressive system is not an easy task, but it is realizable, like the abolition of slavery or any liberation, so long as there is the will to engage in the struggle. So I want to just say that I hope that what you have gotten from this kind of recitation of different calls for the abolishment of prisons, starting that I have over here in 1870 through 1902, 1922, 1926, 1946. There's pieces in I found in 1955, 1971, 1981. I mean, just go on and on and on. And you will see the lineage of these calls. These are calls from people who are incarcerated, as well as calls from people who are on the outside. Again, prison abolition as an idea, a vision, is not new. And many people have believed that these institutions cannot be reformed. Many people over the decades and generations. Now you're probably at the point where you're like, okay, Mariame, so we got it. The system is a hot mess and is actually, racist and classist and sexist and homophobic and transphobic, all those things we now know. We agree. We see the scope of it, huge amount of people ensnared by this system. We know it's a system that's complex and that overlaps and that we're not going to be able to pull one thing out and pull the whole thread, but we're going to have to be working to pull many things out because they compound and they're connected and they're co-constitutive of each other. So I know you're like, yeah, we got that. We also got the kind of histories that emerged as to why it is that we got to where we are. We're also now clear that abolition ain't new, but we still don't know what abolition means. And there's a reason why I start with all the steps that came before. Because it is my belief that we can't understand what we mean by prison abolition or prison industrial complex abolition until we can wrap our hands around the concept of the PIC itself, until we understand the roots of the PIC, and until we understand that the concepts that are being offered around prison industrial complex itself, abolition, aren't new to us, but are things that we are building off of in the present. There are different interpretations of PIC abolition offered by different people. There are different kinds of PIC abolitionists. And this, I think, is incredibly important for us to say and spend a couple of minutes on here, or 1 minute. Some people would say that they are socialist abolitionists, PIC abolitionists. Some people might say they're anarchists, PIC abolitionists. Some people might call themselves communist PIC abolitionists. The political vision of PIC abolition is flexible in terms of praxis. It encompasses a lot of other political ideologies, right? And depending on where you're socially located and where you came up and what your politics are, you're going to maybe agree with the basic principles of PIC abolition, but then have lots of disagreements about A, how we get there, B, what is the analysis, right? Like, these things are happening and abolitionists don't all agree. And I think that's really, really important to lay on the table, because people think that there's, that abolitionists all agree. There are, in fact, again, a couple of core principles that I'm going to talk about in a minute that are going to tell you, those core principles are real, right? Because if you don't believe this, then you're not a PIC abolitionist, you're something else. But whether or not we have a relationship with the state, for example, and how we have one, if there's even a state, is in contention in PIC abolition, right? Because depending on where you sit in your politics, you'll have different answers to that. There are different connotations for folks around, for example, the use of violence. My PIC abolition is rooted in transformative justice. And transformative justice practitioners think we can't end violence by using more violence. But there are plenty of PIC abolitionists who aren't rooted in transformative justice work who think, no, actually, yeah, we can end violence with violence. We do end violence with violence all the time. And that's something I believe in. And I'm still a PIC abolitionist. Yeah. So I want to talk about that. So while abolition is a flexible praxis that's contingent upon social conditions and communal needs, it is built on a set of core principles. To call oneself a prison industrial complex abolitionist means that you're obligated to a certain set of principles in politics. At the most base level, the prison industrial complex abolition is built on at least two core principles. First, it calls for the elimination of policing, imprisonment, sentencing, and surveillance. Here again, PIC abolition calls for the elimination of policing, imprisonment, sentencing, and surveillance. So that's a non-negotiable. If you don't believe in that, then you aren't a prison industrial complex abolitionist, and that's okay. Can I say that again? Everyone doesn't need to be a prison industrial complex abolitionist. If you say you are, however, you are calling for the elimination of policing, imprisonment, sentencing, and surveillance. PIC abolition also rejects the expansion in breadth or scope or legitimation of all aspects of the prison industrial complex. That includes surveillance, policing, sentencing, imprisonment of all sorts. Why is this important? Because when people talk about the PIC abolitionist, people talk about prison abolition, often what they then are centering is only the prison. Only the prison should be abolished. PIC complex abolition insists that we also have to get rid of sentencing and surveillance and policing. And that's something that's much more controversial with people. Many people can imagine the end of prisons before they can imagine the end of policing. So that's something for you to keep in mind. So I want to get into some of the definitions. I mentioned that many different people have many different definitions of abolition, of PIC abolition, and that's true. And I want to highlight just a few of the definitions that I have appreciated. But before then, I just want to highlight this particular quote by Kwame Ture. A revolutionary is primarily concerned with building. Of course, that requires the destruction of what already exists. But if anyone is only talking about destroying, they are not revolutionary. And I love this quote by Kwame Ture, who used to be, who first got known as in the Black freedom struggle of mid-century, mid-20th century as Stokely Carmichael. Kwame Ture, this quote to me embodies abolitionist praxis. It embodies abolitionist praxis. It is about revolutionaries don't just burn shit down. Revolutionaries are interested in creating new things. And that to me is one of the reasons I've always been attracted to PIC abolition, because it's a positive project of creation as much as it is a negative project of dismantling. So I like this definition of PIC abolition by Critical Resistance, who I mentioned earlier. Prison industrial complex abolition is a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. Abolition isn't just about getting rid of buildings full of cages. It's also about undoing the society we live in, because the PIC both feeds on and maintains oppression and inequalities through punishment, violence, and controls millions of people. Because the PIC is not an isolated system, abolition is a broad strategy. An abolitionist vision means that we must build models today that can represent how we want to live in the future. It means developing practical strategies for taking small steps that move us towards making our dreams real. And that leads us all to believe that things really could be different. It means living this vision in our daily lives. Abolition is both a practical organizing tool and a long-term goal. One of the visionaries and people we learn a lot from in abolition praxis and theory is Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And Ruthie, these are a few of the kind of pieces of Ruthie's, what I see as definitions and principles of abolition that I like, that I pulled for you all here. The first is, and these are from different sources, but some are, a couple are from her speeches and some are from interviews, and one is from a written piece. The first one here is from an introduction for a book called The Struggle Within. The purpose of abolition is to expose and defeat all the relationships and policies that make the United States the world's top cop, warmonger, and jailer. Abolition is a movement to end systemic violence, including the interpersonal vulnerabilities and displacements that keep the system going. In other words, the goal is to change how we interact with each other and the planet by putting people before profits, welfare before warfare, and life over death. Again, I like this piece that Ruthie talks about a lot. Abolition requires that we change one thing, which is everything. Again, the idea that it's a complex, it encompasses every part of our society, right? The PIC does. So we have to change one thing, which is absolutely everything. We have to create, we have to create the conditions in our society where then people don't see prisons, policing, and surveillance as viable responses to when harm occurs. Abolition is not absence, but presence, right? So it's not the negative project in terms of just the dismantling and taking away of things, but it's the presence of a whole bunch of other things that exist in the world to create the salutary future that we want. Abolition is a theory of change, it's a theory of social life, and it's about making things. I love this part because I love to make things, and so I like that. I love this by Erica Miners, Dr. Erica Miners, this quote about abolition, because I think, again, it speaks to what you automatically get people viscerally responding to. Abolition does not mean that people will not do, quote, bad things, but that our carceral state does little to reduce the occurrence of violence and harm, and does nothing to alter the social and political conditions that potentially facilitate interpersonal violence. In short, an abolition politic excavates core or root causes of violence masked by the carceral regime. Again, you should take time, read this, sit with it, unpack it. There's so much here, right? Because what Erica is saying here is that what ends up happening with the carceral state is actually masks a whole bunch of the root causes that actually lead to more interpersonal violence. And that in order for us to get to those roots, we got to remove the carceral state. We got to dismantle it in order to be able to actually see how it is that we can address issues. This also offers a non-utopic vision of society into an abolitionist horizon, because it assumes that people will likely continue to harm each other because we're human beings and we do things that way. But that what will change will be our responses to the harm, how we choose to actually transform that harm, right? This is the thing that's key here. Here's Beth Story, who's a filmmaker and a geographer, and Seth Prime's writing in Jacobin. Prison abolitionists like to say that our objective isn't so much the abolition of prisons as it is the abolition of a society that could have prisons. Prison abolition isn't just a movement against cages. It's also a movement for alternative ways of living together and building social infrastructure. And so you see, that's why PIC abolition is not incompatible. In fact, it's completely compatible with fights for climate justice. It has to be. Because if we're not in right relationship with the planet, what are we talking about here? We're not going to be able to survive. And if anything, PIC abolition is a politic of survivability. It's a politic anti-death making. It's a politic of communal care. So keep those things in mind. Take time maybe to break here as you've been going through, and there's only one more section. But I want you to think about, what are the new questions that all these definitions inspire for you? So I want you to think about like the new questions that have been generated by these definitions. Maybe go back and read the definitions again. Maybe read them out loud for yourself. And think about what these mean to you and what these mean for you. You know, for me, what I mean by prison abolition is that I want an end to the whole system of all these reinforcing relationships between surveillance, policing, the courts, and imprisonment, that I see as fueling and maintaining and expanding social and economic inequality and institutional racism. So I just don't want not just the prisons gone, right? It's more accurate to talk about PIC abolition because, again, the prison sits at the center of multiple other forces that we also have to dismantle. And we're interested in, as PIC abolitionists, at least I am, in doing away with the system rather than finding ways to make it work, quote, better, or for it to be kinder and gentler. Because, as I mentioned early on, PIC abolitionists don't actually see the prison industrial complex as broken. We see it as working super well at surveilling and targeting and policing and imprisoning and killing the actual people that it targets, right? And as abolitionists, we're working to diminish the scope and the power of the prison industrial complex while we're simultaneously trying to increase the ability of the communities that are targeted by it to be stronger, to be healthier, to be more self-determined. And PIC abolitionists are constantly asking, what does actual accountability look like? What does actual safety look like? What would justice, what might that look and feel like, right? How do we build our world so that violences in all forms are addressed and reduced? We're concerned, right, with ending the sources of violence as PIC abolitionists. We think prisons and policing and surveillance don't actually solve violence, that they're actually forms of concentrated violence that exist and that are designed to bring about people's premature death. So that's all part of that. We also realize that the logic of using policing, punishment in prisons hasn't actually proven effective to address the systemic causes of violence. So PIC abolition is about challenging the logics and the ethos that make those institutions and practices actually possible. So I want to take us then to, again, another quote that Ruthie uses a lot that I appreciate, which is that abolition is work that people already do. It isn't some like long, it's away over here somewhere else. It's work people already do. It is in the now. We are constantly working towards, using PIC abolition in the now, right? We're practicing it today, right now. Every time we think of new ways of addressing harm without relying on these punishing institutions or the state, we're practicing abolition today. Maybe people feel like that's a controversial thing to say. I don't. I actually do think we are practicing abolition every single day when we take intentional steps towards actually dismantling and shrinking the power of these death-making institutions. I like this quote by Isaac Ontiveros, who worked with critical resistance for many, many years. And Isaac says, how do we think of anything else but prisons and police when we've been indoctrinated with this idea that all problems are solved by locking people up? The system we are up against is not fixed, as I mentioned early on, and those who work as its strategists and technicians aren't stupid, so it grows, changes, adapts, and that includes accommodating and adjusting to, quote, reforms. Our organizing philosophy cautions us to try not to build up something that we have to then knock down later. This is not easy, but is also part of any sustainable process of change. So I like this quote because it really, it brings up many of the things we talked about earlier about the system not being fixed, about, constantly it's always changing and adapting, and so must we. But it situates, again, the notion that, what our work on PIC abolition is also about organizing in the now to get to the world we want to be in, to prefigure the world in which we want to live. So again, it's really important. This part that Isaac brings up, our organizing philosophy cautions us to try not to build up something that we have to knock down later. And in a couple of slides, we're going to talk about reforms and why we need to be really, really mindful and judicious about what reforms we support and push within an abolitionist vision and an abolitionist frame. Here, as Angela Davis teaches us, rather than try to imagine, because one of the questions we have all the time is, well, what comes next? What do we create? What is alternative, right? So here's Angela Davis giving us some real talk. Rather than try to imagine one single alternative to the existing system of incarceration, we might envision an array of alternatives that will require radical transformations of many aspects of our society. Alternatives that fail to address racism, male dominance, homophobia, class bias, and other structures of domination will not, in the final analysis, lead to decarceration and will not advance the goal of abolition. And here's a point that is being picked up by Andrew Dilts in this quote. Basically, again, in order to, PIC abolition means like, we got to change one thing, which is everything, what Ruth Wilson Gilmore teaches us. Andrew Dilts kind of takes it to the step following on Ruthie's provocation and Angela's provocation. PIC abolition is, quote, a call to think more broadly than a single institution or practice, and to recognize that the prison is a target for abolition like chattel slavery before it, because it sits at the intersection between an entire series of institutions and practices that are predicated on the elimination of populations, of the marginalization of persons, and of the exposure to premature death of the many for the sake of the few. So all these kind of three things that I've shared in terms of these quotes are to inform what we need to be doing in our actual organizing. I like these two tweets that I found online. One here by Defund, Disarm, Disband, Zen Marxist, I think is so important. People want to treat will figure it out by working to get there as some sort of rhetorical evasion, instead of being a fundamental expression of trust in the power of conscious collective effort. Let me say that again. People want to treat will figure it out by working to get there as some sort of rhetorical evasion, instead of being a fundamental expression of trust in the power of conscious collective effort. The reason I so appreciate that tweet in just a short few words, Zen Marxist gets at the thing that I think is a trouble point for people to embrace and get to the notion of understanding prison industrial complex abolition. Remember that I said at the beginning that PIC abolition is a vision and it's an organizing strategy. It is not a blueprint. You are not going to have abolitionists lay out the 10-point plan of the new world that will be built. No. Why? Because we recognize that we have to change everything. So that means all our social relations are going to shift and change. And we can't know for sure what the world's going to look like in that next 10 years as we shift and change everything. That's number one. What hubris would it be to come up with some blueprint that is based on what? That's based on the current moment that we're in right now? right? Like, that's not going to be useful to anybody. And the whole process of PIC, we're going to figure it out by working to get there. It's the small steps in between that we're taking to shrink the power, take the power, try things, make small, steps here and there, reconfigure the ways that we transform harm in the current moment, right? That people say, well, that means you don't have a plan. Well, I'm sorry to say that's not how life works. Okay? You're not going to have a ready-made plan for people to follow A through B through Z. Nobody should even want that. Because we have to trust in each other that abolition, PIC abolition, is a collective project. And my personal Mariame Kaba vision of a world without presence is not the world you all want to live in. We're going to have to contest that world. We're going to have to come together and pick and choose and have fights and shape things together, because it's not one person's worldview that's going to win. It's all of us together building the worldview and the world in which we want to live in, community by community, that's going to lead us to the world that we want. And we can start that now by prefiguring the worlds in which we want to live in with small experiments, millions of them, to get to point A from where we are to where we want to go. But this notion that everything's already figured out is ridiculous. We're going to figure it out by working to get there. And it is exactly because we trust that collectively we can figure this out. The second quote here is this point about, I think that a lot of people like the way abolition sounds, but not as much as they like the way revenge feels. So Be Fire Institute quote, I think, is so on point. Because a lot of what gets in the way of people's ability to work towards abolition on a daily basis is the fact that we have a visceral, liminal sense of loving punishment because it feels good, particularly when we've been harmed. That to suffer means that you sometimes want others to suffer too. And that sometimes really can be a gratifying feeling. And that's, again, something we rarely talk about publicly, but is simply true. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the conditions we're in now if this wasn't the case. So intellectually, people may want to be down with PIC abolition. But emotionally, they can't make the gap between the intellectual and the emotional get to this parity level, right? It's just still constantly a struggle and a fight. And I don't think you would be human if that weren't happening and weren't true for everybody. It's true for me. I have to do work all the time to override my revenge feelings in order to be able to remain committed to my abolitionist principles. And I think that's what each of us does on a daily basis. And it isn't easy work. So this is about challenges and perils of reform, and that's how we're going to end. Arguably, every reform that we offer entrenches the power of the state because it gives the state the power to implement that reform. But from an ethical orientation towards emancipation, I think a guiding question on non-reformist reforms is it increasing the possibility of freedom? So I think this is part of a conversation that Harsha Walia and Andrew Dilts had in 2018. And I think it's really helpful because there's always a question of when people kind of in the popular media and other ways, people who don't, haven't really dug deep enough or studied abolition, PIC abolition, often do is it abolition or reform and kind of pit those against each other, right? Or will derisively say, this is a reform, like as though, abolitionists don't actually ever engage reform. So I'm not going to go into it today because there's not enough time. And I think it's not that important, but there are distinctions in terms of reforms by a French philosopher named Andrew Gortz. André Gortz. So André Gortz conceptualized these two kinds of reforms. One which he called non-reformist reforms, and the other one which he called reformist reforms. And in the US, Ruthie Gilmore is the one who kind of brought that concept further into the kind of mainstream of abolitionist thinking and thought in the United States, to say, like, actually, if you're an abolitionist, you're likely, you're going to engage in non-reformist reforms. And what non-reformist reforms are reforms that you don't have to come back in 5 years and tear down, because they've actually expanded and strengthened the very system you want to dismantle, right? So non-reformist reforms take power away from the system. That's a very simple way of thinking about it. Reformist reforms increase the scope and the power of the system you're trying to dismantle. So you don't want to support reformist reforms. People have pushed back on this concept of non-reformist reforms and and have said, no, shouldn't we talk about abolitionist reforms and reformist reforms. So abolitionist reforms, reformist reforms. And then people are like, nah, let's not even talk about reforms. Let's not use that terminology for PIC abolition. Let's just talk about steps towards the goals that we're trying to reach. And let's use the concept of abolitionist steps, So there's a big argument, and that happens mostly online and in rooms, in conference rooms. But most people don't care, and most people see the word reform and they think automatically reform is good. They kind of have they made a moral, they put a moral view on that, not something reform. And reform means you're doing something good. No, reform is just, again, shifting some things to try to get to some other goal that you have set for yourself. Sometimes those goals are powerful and affirmative and about freedom making, and sometimes those goals are about entrenching the status quo. Dean Spade, who's a longtime PIC abolitionist and lawyer, has a series of questions that I think are super helpful to us as we think about the pitfalls of reform. Dean asks these questions. Is a particular tactic or reform recuperative? Recuperative means, is it a reform that is meant to give legitimacy to the status quo? How do you figure that out? And Dean asks these questions to assess. Does it provide material relief? If it doesn't, it's recuperative. So it's something that will actually maintain the status quo, right? Because it's not providing material relief to people. What is the point? Does it leave out an especially marginalized group of people? So are people with criminal records told that they can't be part of this? Are people who are undocumented, are they left out? Are sex workers left out? Are people who use drugs left out? If it leaves out an especially marginalized group, then it's a recuperative reform, a reform that entrenches the status quo. Does it legitimize or expand a system we're trying to dismantle? We've talked a lot about that already. Does it mobilize the most affected for ongoing struggle? So is what you're doing actually building power? Are the folks who are impacted part of this? Are they centered in this? Do they have a significant role in the direction of your campaign and the work that you're actually doing? So what we don't want in terms of the reforms or steps that we are, kind of working with and working around, we don't want steps and reforms that provide no material relief and no reduction in harm. We don't want steps where relief only reaches the least marginalized. We don't want reforms and steps that offer window dressing or legitimization of harmful systems and institutions. We don't want steps or reforms that tinker and don't reach to the root causes. We don't want steps that expand harmful systems. We don't want steps that divides into deserving and undeserving people. So use these criteria as you're evaluating what kinds of tactics and steps and reforms you might subscribe to in your organizing. Try to go through this. And some of it, it's like, it's not a science, it's art. So you're going to sometimes be like, okay, well, some people who are most marginalized are not part of this, but 7 out of 8 of folks are, we're going to push this and we're going to come back to fight another day, right? These are not things that are prescriptions that you have to stick to by any means necessary in that way. They are to inform your strategies, to be like honest with yourselves about what kinds of steps you're fighting for, and know when you're leaving a bunch of people behind, whether that's running the truck over people and making it impossible for those people to get free, versus we're going to fight to this day and get as many people out as we can now, but knowing full well that we're not going to create language or narratives or whatever that are going to make it impossible for those other people to get out when we come back to fight another day. So we're going to always be working along those lines. So I also like Erica, who I mentioned before in the definitions of abolition. I like these questions that Erica asks about thinking about reforms. Who benefits from this campaign initiative reform form of resistance, and who doesn't, and why? What are the logics? This part, I really appreciate this question. What are the logics, languages, and common sense discourses that initiatives validate and or reinforce? Are these logics liberatory or punitive? Who is working on this initiative? Who is not? Why us? Why now? Is this something that we or others will be organizing to undo in 5 years because it is used to cage or dehumanize people? Again, good series of questions to keep in mind. You know, if you want, and you're looking at this on your own time, you might want to just print out your own questions. Add your questions, keep growing these lists. These are just some folks that I really admire and have a lot of respect for in terms of their thinking as strategists, organizers, theorists of PIC abolition. And just I use these too to try to evaluate where I'm doing and what I'm doing on a regular basis. So offering those in that spirit. So this is the end of what I wanted to share with you. And what I hope that you have gotten from this time we've had, I think it's about 90 minutes. I hope it is a little bit more than that, maybe. But I wanted to offer that, we're in a place where when we're talking about abolition, there's no ready-made models, that there's a demand for creativity, that we don't know what's going to happen, and that's okay. And that certainty isn't required as we work towards abolition, that we should hold fast to possibility over certainty, and that we should get comfortable with the unknown, that we have to recognize also that imagination is required all the time. Abolition is imagining a new way. And so I really am excited. I hope that those of you who have had a chance to listen to this today feel like you have a grounded beginning sense, like a better foundation from which to learn more, to read more, to engage in your communities, do more political education with each other, to keep organizing and figuring it out as we do this work, and to keep asking questions and keep growing those questions over time. That's what this is all about. And, as difficult as the work is that we're doing, because folks are really being tortured in these death chambers, folks are killed by the police and harmed, and there are many more people who are harmed by the cops and by policing than there are that even, that are killed by policing. Like the numbers of deaths are not the measure by which we should look at how horrific the system is. So many people injured, so many people terrorized, so many people harassed, millions every single year, right? That can feel so dispiriting and maybe despair-inducing. But what I want to end with is that PIC abolition, though, it's a movement filled with hope. And people who are doing this work are doing hopeful work in and of itself, because focusing on freedom and liberation is hopeful work. And so I hope that you find your people and you find your communities and you stick together and you keep learning and keep growing, and that this particular session is a way for you to think about the concept of transformative justice being a framework that we use that is informed by an abolitionist politic. You cannot understand transformative justice if you don't understand PIC abolition. These things are so critically linked together. It doesn't mean, however, that all abolitionists believe in transformative justice. Everybody who believes in transformative justice, however, has to believe in PIC abolition. And I think that's really critical. So some resources I'm offering, go to transformharm.org. It's a portal of resources that I have put together with several other people. Articles, curricula, stories, media clips, every possible thing in categories of transformative justice, abolition, restorative justice, healing justice. You can find what you want to find there, and you can, if whatever else you don't find there, send us suggestions of what you found that we should add. Critical Resistance as a site, go to their website, find out what work they're doing, support them. I love the piece, the text I mentioned before, Instead of Prisons, and published in 1976, is really an important document to read if you want some grounding in kind of the histories of one of the histories of PIC abolition. I very much recommend reading Golden Gulag by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. I think that Golden Gulag makes a great book club book so that you can discuss it with other people. I found it much better when I was reading it with other people than when I was reading it on my own, in the sense that I had lots of questions, lots of thoughts, lots of things I needed to discuss with other people. And I think that this book provokes so many questions that you should, if you can, read it with other people. I love Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. It's a small book. It's a cogent, coherent argument, and it's a great first book to read. If you haven't read anything about PIC abolition yet, go ahead and read Our Prisons Obsolete first, and it's a book you can read in a night. So go ahead and take that on and do that work. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm thrilled that you're going to participate in this mixtape. I hope you get so much out of it. I hope you get so many more questions, that that are answered, and more that you have at the end of this process, then we will have done our jobs. Thank you so much for joining me today.